Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with one of the biggest, most, perplexing economic puzzles of our time. It's something that really affects the life path, the mental health of an entire generation all over the world. We're talking about the modern housing crisis.
Right.
And we're going to try and move past the usual surface level talk about, interest rates or inflation.
Yeah, the headline stuff.
Exactly. Our source material today takes a much deeper cut. It argues that the whole idea of a home has changed. It's shifted from being a simple necessity, a shelter,
to a financial asset, a really potent one.
and that one shift has created this massive systemic misalignment between generations.
And that structural misalignment, that's really our mission today. We're unpacking all this research, but not to, assign blame.
Yeah.
It's not about pointing fingers at governments or banks or even the generations that came before you. The goal here is to just meticulously map out the new rules of the game.
The rules that are playing out right now.
Exactly. The sources are really clear on this. You, the listener, need to understand these systemic forces so you don't internalize what the research calls a quiet mental crisis.
And quiet mental crisis.
Yeah, that devastating feeling of personal failure.
Yeah.
For circumstances that are, when you look at the math, structurally outside of your individual control.
That's a critical starting point. And at the heart of that crisis is this one core idea, a thesis that just cuts through all the noise. It suggests housing has become a form of financial security, a physical asset that just goes up in value way, way faster than any individual effort or salary can possibly keep up with.
The source material has a great phrase for it.
What's that?
A stock with a shape.
A stock with a shape. That's perfect.
It really is. It's the ultimate economic bait and switch, isn't it?
Yeah.
Society tells you, hey, your labor is the path to wealth.
Right. Work hard, you'll get there.
But the real machine for creating wealth has been completely rerouted. It's all about assets now. So we're looking at the complete financialization of what should be a basic human need.
And it forces your labor to compete directly against capital.
A race it can't win.
Okay, so let's unpack that transformation because it really defines the whole problem.
Yeah.
When did a house stop being, mainly a place to live
Right.
and become this product of speculation, this financial tool? How did that even happen?
Well, the sources identify it less as a sudden event and more as a tipping point. Historically, the whole point of a house was security, right? Protection. But as capital markets got more sophisticated and cities just exploded in size, the land underneath the house started to represent future value.
So it's about the land, not the building.
Primarily, yes. The transformation happens when the investment value of the property, its ability to go up in price, starts to outweigh its utility value, its ability to just be a home.
And it just morphs into something else entirely.
It becomes a tool for accumulating wealth, a channel for passive investment. Sometimes it's just a physical thing you hold to protect against inflation.
So when the house makes that switch into an asset class, the analysis says the younger generation becomes the payer.
They become the payers.
What's the immediate, the visceral cost of that on the social fabric?
Oh, the cost is foundational. In so many cultures, there's this really deep-seated belief. You see it in concepts like the Vietnamese idea of an cư.
Okay.
It means securing your residence, establishing a settled life is the foundation you need for Latinx. A stable career, a stable life.
So you settle down first, then you build everything else.
Exactly. You get your roots down, then you build your wealth, your family, your career. The sources argue that this sequence has been tragically turned on its head.
How so?
Stable housing isn't the foundation for success anymore. It's become the ultimate prize for success you've already achieved.
And a prize that's reserved for another class.
It's increasingly reserved for the wealthy or the already established. That foundational stability that let previous generations dream bigger. It's now a distant privilege.
So we have this promise drilled into us. If you work hard, if you save your money, you will eventually own a home. But the analysis says prices have just outrun any realistic amount of effort.
They've achieved escape velocity from wages.
Can we actually quantify that feeling of hopelessness?
You can, yeah. It's quantified by the market's velocity, which we'll get into. But the hopelessness really comes from the cognitive dissonance.
What do you mean?
I mean, you're doing everything you were told was right. You're working 2 jobs, saving like crazy, cutting all your expenses.
And the goalpost just keeps moving further away.
Exactly. The harder you run, the further ahead the finish line seems to get. The price of the asset doesn't care about your effort. It only cares about capital flows and scarcity. Your work becomes irrelevant to the outcome.
And this is where the sources point to what they call the blameless system. This really painful observation that no one in power, not the banks, not the regulators, not politicians, takes any responsibility.
No, it's always deflected.
It's always just, oh, that's the market, or it's the laws of economics.
It's just the natural rules. And that generalization is so psychologically damaging. The sources are absolutely scathing about this idea that it's some inevitable force of nature.
Right?
They stress, specifically, that a house demanding 25 or 30 years of an average salary is not a natural law of the universe.
It's a choice.
It's the result of 1,000 policy choices. Capital deregulation, specific tax structures, and this is critical, a collective social psychology that's layered on top of real scarcity.
If it were a natural law, everywhere would be the same.
Precisely. The affordability ratios would be consistent across the globe, and they're not. This constant deflection of blame is what forces individuals to conclude, falsely, that their inability to buy must be a personal moral failing.
I must not be smart enough, or I must be too lazy.
Exactly, something is wrong with me.
You mentioned the price decoupling from its purpose. The source calls the house a stock with a shape. How did that actually work in practice?
It works like an unlisted high-performing stock. But unlike regular stocks, it has relatively low volatility compared to, say, tech stocks.
Okay.
It has this huge societal belief in its permanence, and it gives you a dual benefit. You could get rental income, and you get what feels like guaranteed capital appreciation because land is scarce.
So the buyer doesn't even need to use it.
They just need to hold it. And that financial definition immediately splits the market into two totally different types of buyers.
The great divide. The speculator versus the resident.
The ones who buy to multiply their wealth, and the ones who just want a place to live.
And why, according to this analysis, does the resident almost always lose that race?
Because they're playing a completely different game with totally conflicting objectives.
How so?
The speculator has patience, they have leverage, time is their best friend. They just need to wait for the price to go up, which the system structurally guarantees over the long run.
But the resident?
The resident is operating under immense real-life pressure. They have to deal with inflation on their food and gas. They're thinking about the cost of raising a family. They have to live in expensive city centers to be near their jobs.
And there's the psychological weight of it all.
A huge psychological burden of just waiting and hoping. The speculator can afford for the market to go flat for a couple of years. The resident can't because their ability to save is getting eaten alive by the cost of living every single day.
One is playing a game of wealth, the other is playing a game of survival.
Exactly. And when those two players are competing for the same limited asset, the one motivated by pure capital will always, always win.
That is a profound insight. That your effort is just rendered meaningless by the asset's own momentum. And it leads to that quiet, existential question the source brings up. If I can't even get this fundamental piece of stability, this sense of belonging, what's the point of all my hard work?
It moves from being a financial problem to an existential one.
Right.
It attacks your core sense of self-efficacy. Society promises you have control. You put in effort, you get a proportional result. The housing market is a massive structural demonstration that that promise is broken, and that leads to this widespread feeling of futility.
Okay, so this feeling of futility, as you say, it rests on something really obvious, but also incredibly powerful. Land scarcity.
Yeah.
Land is the source of the tragedy because, as the source notes, it's not just physically finite. It's socially, economically, and psychologically finite too.
That is absolutely the key. We can build skyscrapers, we can increase density, but we cannot replicate the land mass itself.
We can't make more land.
We can't. And more importantly, we can't replicate the social value that's attached to a specific piece of land. A plot in a thriving city center is finite in a way that's totally unique among economic assets.
You can increase the supply of almost anything else.
Almost anything. Cars, food, information. You can even, find more gold through deep mining, but you cannot create more prime real estate.
And that leads us to this law of absolute limitation. Fixed supply plus ever-increasing demand.
Driven by population growth, urbanization.
Means the price just has to go up over time. This is the inescapable math.
It's the brutal baseline. The sources are clear on this. Even the best government policy can only sort of modulate the rate of increase. It can't reverse the fundamental scarcity that's dictated by geography and demography.
And so when supply is fixed and demand is constantly rising,
And that demand includes highly leveraged speculative capital.
the price trajectory is just inevitable.
It is. The market naturally sorts in favor of whoever has the most money, pushing the asset further and further out of reach for people on a salary.
Which makes the modern economic paradox we live in so glaring. Technology has made almost everything else cheaper. Communication, entertainment, phones, cars.
But housing just completely reverses that trend.
How does the source material trace that movement, that progression of burden?
It charts a very clear path. Housing starts as a basic need, then it gets redefined as an asset. Once it's an asset, it becomes a social symbol of success.
And that status makes it a target for speculation.
Right, which transforms it into a speculative channel, attracting huge amounts of capital. This raises its status again to a social value metric, a scorecard for your life.
Until it finally becomes the benchmark of maturity itself.
And the reason it reverses that economic trend is that any efficiency gains we make in construction, the bricks and mortar, are just completely dwarfed by the non-replicable value of the land underneath it. We are paying for the scarcity, not the structure.
And this scarcity is just violently amplified by urbanization, by the concentration of value. Why does cramming all the jobs and amenities into one place drive the price so much higher than anything else?
Because that concentration creates what is essentially non-negotiable value. Land in cities like Tokyo or New York isn't expensive because it's pretty.
No.
It's expensive because it gives you proximity to the best jobs, the best schools, superior healthcare, social networks, all the infrastructure.
It creates a feedback loop, right?
A powerful, positive feedback loop. The more opportunity concentrates, the more people move there. That increases competition for the fixed supply of land, which drives the price up. That rising price attracts more speculative capital, which reinforces the scarcity even more.
The land's value becomes a pure function of its rarity.
Its rarity and the demand for access to everything around it.
Which brings us directly to this massive generational misalignment. Let's look at that comparison you mentioned. Buyer 1 from 20 years ago paying maybe 3 years of their salary.
Right.
And buyer 2 today paying 25 years. This is where the structural injustice just becomes so clear.
This is so much more than just inflation. This is an asset transfer. It's a fundamental imbalance.
How so?
The earlier buyer, the older generation, they used a tiny fraction of their lifetime earnings to get an asset that has since appreciated exponentially. They benefited massively from this whole shift.
And the later buyer?
The later buyer, the young generation, has to commit decades of their future earnings to buy the exact same asset, just to get the stability the first buyer took for granted.
So one reaped the reward of appreciation, the other bears the burden of financialization.
Exactly. And this is a direct counter to that common rebuttal you always hear. Well, my generation worked hard, why can't yours?
Right. The sources really detail why today's struggle is fundamentally different.
It is. We have to acknowledge the effort of the previous generation, of course. But you also have to list the radical differences in context.
Like what?
Well, 20 years ago, the competitive landscape was just less intense. Land prices were genuinely low relative to income. There was a functional link between saving and buying. And crucially, speculation was limited.
It wasn't the main driver.
Not at all. Today's youth face intense global competition for high-paying jobs, overwhelming speculative capital fueled by cheap credit from all over the world, and a baseline land value that's already been multiplied 5 or 10 times over.
So they aren't just competing in a slower market.
They're running against a system that has been engineered to move faster than they can.
This brings us to the source's most powerful analogy, the unbeatable velocity. The math behind this income gap is just staggering. Salaries up 3 to 5% a year.
If you're lucky.
While house prices are soaring 10, 15, sometimes even 20% a year in hot markets.
The analogy is just perfect. The young are running on footling chaibo, a slow, steady pace of personal effort.
But the price is a racing car.
It's a racing car chaibo fueled by capital and expectation. If the asset goes up 15% and your income only grows by 5%, the gap between you widens by 10% every single year.
It's not a slow drift. It's an active divergence.
It's an active divergence that punishes saving and rewards just owning things. It's an inequality of asset ownership that becomes a generational inequality.
And what about the existential cost? The loss of belonging. The sources say this is about more than just money.
Oh, it's the loss of your psychological safety anchor. From a primal evolutionary perspective, a home is the line between the secure, known world and the uncertain, dangerous world outside.
Right.
When you can't own a home, or you're constantly forced to move because of rising rents, that fundamental sense of existential safety is just It's compromised.
The source is called the loss of roots.
Yes. And a lack of roots means a lack of peace, which in turn stifles your ability to plan long-term, to commit to a difficult career, to dream big about your future.
So this generation is forced to live in a state of perpetual temporary residence.
Even in their own minds.
Okay, let's focus on the cruel math of that speed gap, this income-asset decoupling. The source's equation is brutal. 1 year of hard work can equal just 1 month of house price appreciation. How does that devastating ratio play out for an average person trying to save month to month?
Okay, so imagine you work diligently for 12 months. You sacrifice, you put away, say, 20% of your income for a down payment.
They're doing everything right.
Everything.
Right.
But over those same 12 months, the price of the home you're saving for has gone up by 15%.
Okay.
Because the asset base, the price of the home is so large that 15% increase can easily equal or even exceed the total amount of money you saved over 11 of those months.
So your efforts aren't generating a net gain.
You're just treading water. You're trying to stop the gap from getting even wider. The psychological toll of realizing you've essentially worked for free for 11 months, it's immense.
We have to understand why salary lags so far behind assets. The sources give 4 big reasons. Let's start with the first, the difference between productivity and psychology.
This is the core structural reason: salaries. They only rise slowly, incrementally. They're based on genuine labor productivity.
And productivity growth is just slow.
Inherently slow, especially in economies that rely on service jobs where it's harder to get those big tech gains. Wages also get held down by corporate pressure to keep costs low and by education systems that...
Well, they don't always equip people with high-value skills right out of the gate.
Land prices. Land prices are fueled by something totally different. Collective social belief, fear of scarcity, speculative cash flow. Land doesn't require productivity, it just requires belief.
And that belief, that psychology, completely overrides the value of human effort.
The sources are clear on this. Labor strength cannot beat speculative psychology.
Which leads right to the second reason, the capital magnet. Why is real estate so much more attractive to big money than, say, manufacturing or tech?
Because capital flows to where the friction is lowest and the return is highest. It's that simple.
And the profit margins are that different.
The sources note that real estate profit margins are often 3 to 5 times higher than traditional manufacturing and double that of many tech sectors.
Wow, why?
Well, think about manufacturing. You need huge investments in equipment, you have to manage supply chains, deal with complex labor laws, and you have to constantly innovate just to stay in the game.
The profit is hard-won.
It's full of friction. Real estate, on the other hand, especially just buying land in a growing city, it offers a near guaranteed return just by holding the asset. There's less operational risk, less pressure to innovate, and the appreciation is often underwritten by government spending on infrastructure.
So it just acts like a vacuum.
It sucks investment capital away from the sectors that actually create jobs and productivity, starving them of the funds they need.
The third reason is intensely modern, the social media illusion. This is about perception versus reality?
Oh, absolutely. There is this profound and really harmful disconnect. The median income for a young adult in many of the urban centers studied is surprisingly low, often around, say, $500 to $800 a month.
But that's not what you see online.
Not at all. Your social media feed is just saturated with images of luxury, easy success, financial freedom, claims of effortless wealth. This curated reality creates a false baseline.
A false expectation that early homeownership should be normal.
Right. And so when a young person who's earning a completely normal statistical median wage fails to meet this impossible, illusory standard, they internalize it. They think they're uniquely lazy or incompetent.
They feel shame for achieving what is actually the normal outcome.
In a mathematically rigged environment, yes.
And the fourth reason explains what we're actually paying for. It's not the materials, it's the expectation.
This is crucial. When you buy an apartment for, say, $300,000, maybe $50,000 of that is the actual cost of the concrete, the steel, the labor.
So what's the other $250,000?
That's the cost of the scarcity of the land it sits on, and it's the cost of the future expectation of that land's value. You're not paying for a dwelling, you're paying for a share of a limited resource in a high-demand spot.
And it's priced based on the future, not the present.
Exactly. Priced on anticipated future value, which is driven by speculation and perceived social status. The physical construction is a small, linear cost. The land and the expectation are the massive exponential costs.
Which brings us back to that mathematical trap. The linear versus the exponential. A straight line of your savings will never catch that accelerating curve of the asset price.
The math is just unforgiving. If you're saving $2,000 a month, your growth is predictable, it's linear.
Okay.
But if the asset you want is worth $500,000 and it's appreciating at 12% a year, that's $60,000 a gain just by sitting there.
So to catch up, you'd need to save.
You'd need to save $5,000 a month just to cover the appreciation, and that's before you even touch the principal. This is the root of that feeling of existential powerlessness.
Because you can control your effort, but it's irrelevant compared to the market.
You can maximize the variables you control, but they are functionally meaningless compared to the forces you can't.
And this futility, it leads directly to what the sources call the societal delay trap. What are the direct consequences of these high prices on people's life choices?
The consequences are severe. They're sociological. The sources directly link high housing costs to lower rates of marriage, a significant drop in birth rates in cities, and demonstrably higher rates of depression and mental distress among young adults.
And this isn't laziness, it's a rational choice.
It's rational fear. They are rationally choosing to delay these huge life decisions, starting a family, getting married, because they can't secure the basic financial stability they feel they need to responsibly raise children.
So the system fails to provide that anchor.
And it forces individuals to delay the very markers of maturity that were standard for the generations before them.
Let's talk about the engine of this growth, speculation. The source material argues that it's moved beyond just being for the wealthy few. It's become a social instinct.
It's the total normalization of that behavior. Speculation used to be a fringe activity for the financial elites, the sharks as the sources call them.
Right.
Now it's the assumed default behavior of the middle class, of retirees looking for stable income, even salaried employees trying to protect their savings.
So when the entire society fixates on real estate as the only game in town,
The pressure on prices becomes immense, and it just feeds on itself.
and critically, the main driver here isn't greed, it's fear. That's a subtle but really profound psychological difference.
It's absolutely profound, and the fear has multiple layers. First, there's the fear of being left behind set. This terror that if you wait 6 more months, the price will jump another 10%, and it'll be out of reach forever.
The fear of missing out.
Yeah, and the fear of missing out on what is perceived as the only viable path to generational wealth. But then there's a third, more coercive fear.
What's that?
The fear of being seen as ignorant or financially dumb within your social circle.
So that fear is actually a stronger motivator than just needing a place to live.
Much stronger. People are entering the market defensively, not aggressively, but it still drives the price up all the same.
And this anxiety gets codified into this default investment strategy, this ironclad social belief that land never loses.
That belief is the bedrock of the entire system. Because it seems to require minimal skill, unlike, trading volatile stocks, and historically it's been low risk, real estate just becomes the default place to put any savings.
Which leads to this buy-to-hold behavior.
Massive buy-to-hold behavior. Millions of units are purchased just to store value, not to be lived in, not to be rented out efficiently. This hoarding starves the market of supply,
Making the scarcity worse.
and ensuring that the original belief that prices must rise is validated.
We often blame the ultra-rich for driving the market, but the source emphasizes that it's actually the middle class that's the crucial engine. Why is that?
Because the ultra-rich, there's just not that many of them. The middle class, though, represents millions of people with enough borrowing power, a lot of anxiety, and access to bank credit.
They're not buying mansions?
No, they're buying their first or second or third small apartment or plot of land as a buffer against inflation, as a retirement plan. And these millions of individual decisions,
Added.
they flood the market with demand and capital, absorbing any new supply almost instantly. So the middle class, with their understandable need for security, are unknowingly acting as the chief engine of speculative price inflation.
And this feeds into what you call the expectation loop, where the psychological anticipation actually creates the reality.
It's a classic self-fulfilling prophecy. A government announces, hey, we're building a new metro line in 5 years.
Okay.
Immediately, prices in that area will skyrocket 200, 300% before a single shovel has hit the ground.
So the price rises purely on the expectation.
Purely on the expectation of future value. And once that price rise happens, it reinforces the belief that land is a miracle investment, which attracts more capital, which reinforces the expectation. The market is just driven by forward-looking belief.
Which is the illusion of consensus, or, as the source calls it, Tumley-Beidon herd mentality.
The collective psychological effect is just overwhelming. When everyone around you is buying, you feel foolish for not getting in on it. That collective action confirms the shared belief that the price must go up, regardless of the economic fundamentals or the actual need for housing.
So people are buying out of a need to follow the crowd.
Not out of an individual need for shelter. The collective belief in eternal growth creates this massive, self-sustaining bubble.
And finally, the analysis touches on how the house has shifted to become the core measure of worth in society.
This might be the most insidious cultural part of it. The question, have you bought a house yet, has replaced questions about your character, your education, your contribution to society.
It's the primary social metric.
It's become synonymous with maturity, stability, and belonging. And this pressure forces young people to prioritize buying a property, even if it means taking on crushing debt or living somewhere totally unsuitable.
Just to meet this artificial external standard of success.
They overpay not for the shelter, but for the social validation it gives them.
Okay, let's switch lenses completely now. We're moving from individual psychology to these huge national constraints. If high prices are causing so much distress, why doesn't the government just step in, legislate them down, or allow correction?
The sources provide a pretty grim answer to that. Housing isn't just shelter. It's an irreplaceable pillar of the entire national economy.
So it's a stability paradox.
Exactly. The sharp drop in prices that the younger generation desperately needs for affordability would be a catastrophic national event. The system, as it's currently built, relies on high or steadily increasing asset values just to stay solvent.
So allowing a correction means intentionally triggering a recession.
And massive banking failure and a loss of global confidence.
Let's get into the data the sources cite. Real estate is 15 to 30% of GDP, 60 to 75% of household assets, and 40 to 50% of bank credit.
Huge numbers.
So if prices drop, what's the exact mechanism of that systemic risk?
Okay, let's trace the ripple effect, starting with the banks. They hold all these mortgages and loans to developers. Those loans are all backed by the land and the houses themselves. That's the collateral. If the market value of that collateral drops by, say, 15 or 20%,
Banks are suddenly in trouble.
they have to immediately revalue all that collateral downwards. This creates a massive hole on their balance sheet because their assets, the collateral, now barely cover the value of the loans they made.
Which spikes their credit risk.
Across the board. And so what does that do to the general economy?
They stop lending.
They're forced to restrict lending dramatically. A credit crunch. They stop issuing new mortgages, they call in high-risk loans, and crucially, they cut off the flow of money to all the small and medium-sized businesses that rely on credit to operate and expand.
And the whole economy grinds to a halt.
Starved of liquidity, yes. Construction stops, businesses fail, unemployment spikes. Governments know that a small drop in housing prices today leads to widespread, uncontrolled business failure and unemployment tomorrow.
And beyond the banks, there's the employment multiplier. The sources describe the real estate sector as the economy's heart.
Because it touches so many other industries, a construction boom isn't just about developers. It's millions of jobs in cement, steel, logistics, transportation, architecture, engineering, finance.
So if development stalls,
This massive interconnected workforce suffers immediate mass unemployment. No responsible government is going to intentionally create mass joblessness in a critical sector just to lower housing costs for one demographic,
the priority is stability.
which, ironically, is equated with high prices.
Then we have the social trap, the silent majority. This is about the political challenge.
And this is just the democratic reality. The political voice and the economic power of the majority of asset owners, the middle-aged and the elderly, is far stronger than the struggling youth.
And they want high prices.
Of course they do. Their properties, their retirement fund, it's their inheritance for their kids, it's their life savings. Any politician who proposes measures that would devalue 70% of household wealth is facing guaranteed political ruin,
So the state is incentivized to protect the wealth of the majority.
even if it's at the expense of the next generation's ability to even get into the market.
And finally, the intervention paradox. Even when they try to help, the policies can backfire.
Yeah, look at attempts to tax speculation or limit credit. When a government signals it wants to control prices, what do investors do? They don't sell. They often hoard the property, thinking that future restrictions will make the asset even rarer and more valuable.
And developers slow down.
Exactly, because future pricing is uncertain. And if you limit credit, yeah, you reduce the number of buyers, but you reduce the supply of new homes even faster.
Which leads to a tighter market and even higher prices.
Perversely, yes. The system fights back against these attempts to deflate it, and it often makes the initial problem worse.
Which leads to what you call the Stoic realization. If the prices are basically uncontrollable, what's the essential lesson?
The essential lesson is cognitive liberation. It's freedom. You have to realize that the price of a house is an external force. It's governed by markets, by banks, by social consensus.
It's not about you.
Your success or failure to acquire a house is an economic outcome. It is not a personal, moral assessment of your worth. The sources stress this over and over. The greatest damage is internalizing the failure. The Stoic view forces us to accept the reality of the external structure and remove the blame from ourselves.
Your effort is in your control, the market is not.
Precisely.
Okay, this next part is maybe the most difficult truth in the source material. Society ignores this crisis because nearly every single segment, including, tragically, the people being harmed, benefits from high prices, or at least from the silence around them.
It creates this powerful social blind spot. The problem is so obvious, but because all these powerful groups have a vested interest in keeping things as they are, any pressure for real reform is just neutralized.
Let's go through them group by group, starting with the previous generations.
Their calculation is simple. Their home is their insurance policy. It's their biggest asset. Their life's work is tied up in its value.
So they will oppose anything that threatens that value.
Fiercely. Tax hikes, forced sales, development subsidies, anything that might devalue their retirement, their kids' inheritance, or their sense of lifetime financial achievement. Their need for stability translates directly into opposing lower prices.
What about speculators and investors?
They're just rational players in the game. They're profiting because they read the rules correctly. They aren't breaking the law. They're following the incentives that were set up by the government and the banks.
So they have zero motivation to change the rules.
None. They are the beneficiaries of the current arrangement.
And the banks.
Banks need that loan collateral to be stable. They need high asset valuations to maintain liquidity and minimize their risk. A high-priced, slowly appreciating market is perfect for long-term mortgage stability.
They are structurally bound to support high prices.
They have to be.
Local governments.
Local governments rely heavily on land revenue. Auction sales, development fees, property taxes, that's what funds their schools, their hospitals, their infrastructure.
So a drop in prices is a direct cut to their budget.
An immediate, painful cut. So they're incentivized to promote growth and high land values because their fiscal health depends on it.
Developers.
Their entire business model rests on the expectation of continuous price appreciation. They have to perpetually sell the story of scarcity and future value just to get financing and generate demand.
They are the primary agents constantly reinforcing the buy now narrative.
They have to be.
And what about the media?
The dominant media narrative often reflects the interests of the asset-owning class, not the laboring class. The coverage focuses on investment strategies, success stories, celebrating wealth,
Reinforcing the high price standard as normal and attainable.
while the struggle of the median wage earner is often just an anecdote, not the main story.
But the deepest irony, the sources say, lies with the youth themselves, this half-victim, half-accomplice dynamic.
This is the cruelest psychological trap. Young people who are close to buying or who have just managed to get a deposit down, they actually fear a market crash.
They don't want the prices to drop.
Not for their asset, no. They want prices to be lower so people can get in, but once they are in, they need their own specific asset to maintain or increase its value.
So this short-term self-interest stops them from demanding lower prices collectively.
Because they're afraid of immediate negative equity or losing their hard-won deposit, their own self-interest binds them to the very system that has been crushing them.
They have to maintain confidence in the price mechanism that made it so painful for them to begin with.
It's a terrible bind.
And what about family silence as self-defense?
This one is profoundly psychological. Parents often can't bring themselves to tell their children the truth. To say, look, given how things are, homeownership is an unreasonable expectation.
Why not?
To admit that is to admit their own powerlessness, or to admit that the system that worked for them has failed their children, and that admission is just too painful.
So instead,
Instead, they often shift the burden, you just need to work harder. They transfer the guilt and the weight of this impossible task onto the young person, rather than acknowledging the systemic failure.
so the result is a total deadlock. Every single stakeholder, including some of those being harmed, is motivated against reform.
And that collective self-interest becomes the social consensus, cementing the painful high price as the unavoidable normal.
So this brings us to the most vital question. What's the path forward? We have to start by saying plainly that the old generational contract is broken.
It's fundamentally broken. The idea of work hard, get a house, settle down. This generation is being judged by the standards of an economic era that is functionally dead.
And the core pain, that existential crisis, is the feeling of being rootless, a temporary resident in your own life. It's the crisis of what the sources call the anchorage of meaning. If the system can't provide physical stability, where do you find it?
The first step, the absolutely critical step, is to reject self-blame. You have to stop internalizing the failures. Stop believing that you are lacking or that you are lazy.
You're struggling against the system.
You're struggling against systemic capital flow and speculative psychology. Just understanding the physics of the problem, the linear you running against the exponential curve, that is the key to mental liberation.
And that frees up the energy you were spending on guilt and shame.
Exactly.
So we adopt this stoic or existential way forward. Control what you can control. Focus your internal effort on new strategies for survival. Let's get into the 7 practical directions the source material lays out.
Okay, number 1, focus on rare skills. Brute force effort is not enough. Since the system values high-margin assets, your labor has to become a high-margin skill.
What does that mean in practice?
It means moving towards specialized knowledge, complex technology, roles with high intellectual barriers to entry. You have to strategically increase your personal income velocity through specialized knowledge, not just by working more hours of general labor.
Okay. Number 2, redefine life strategy.
Homeownership cannot be the absolute number 1 priority. If you make it the anchor, you will sacrifice too much of your life. The new strategy has to be sequential.
First things first.
First, achieve professional competence. Second, attain financial independence, minimal debt, strong savings. Third, secure emotional and communal stability. Home ownership moves down the list from primary goal to a secondary financial objective.
Number 3, upgrade the renting mindset.
Renting has to be reframed. It is not a failure. It is a rational lifestyle choice used by successful, stable people all over the world.
The strategy.
A life model. The goal is to maximize your quality of life within the rental structure. Prioritize location, enjoy the freedom from maintenance costs, and value the flexibility of not being tied down to an asset. Embracing renting strategically removes immense mental pressure.
Number 4 is about buying, but strategically. Strategic buying.
Right. If you do choose to buy, the sources say you have to take a radical departure from the herd. Buy small, buy affordable, and buy only for utility to live in.
Not for status or for speculation.
Not at all. The purchase has to be viewed as locking down a cost, not as building wealth. And you only commit when your financial buffer is big enough to handle volatility without collapsing the rest of your life.
Number 5, alternative locations.
The crisis is hyper-concentrated in those prime urban centers. A strategic move to a satellite city, a secondary province, or a high-quality remote work environment can drastically change that income-to-housing price ratio.
This isn't giving up.
No, it's not sacrificing opportunity. It's strategically matching your capacity to a sustainable environment. It's choosing life quality over maximum centralized concentration.
Number 6 is the philosophical anchor. Build spiritual assets.
Since physical stability is so tenuous, internal stability becomes essential. This means investing in your own resilience, your adaptability, your mental health, maybe even minimalism.
You're creating an inner shelter.
An inner shelter, a set of strong, unshakable values and coping mechanisms that ensure that even when the external world is volatile, your sense of self-worth and your peace remain secure.
And finally, number 7, a new definition of an ensuge, of a settled life.
The old definition, owning a physical building, it's obsolete for this generation. Stability has to be redefined as professional freedom, emotional peace, control over your time and your debt levels, a sense of belonging in a community. A settled life is a state of being where you can breathe freely, regardless of whose name is on the deed.
True stability is internal, not measured in square feet.
It's internal and structural. And the empowering conclusion here is that this generation, they might not acquire material assets early on, but by navigating this crisis with self-awareness, they can acquire a level of internal freedom and resilience that previous generations, who were often blinded by fast asset accumulation, spent a lifetime trying to find.
This deep dive has established a chilling clarity. The housing crisis is fundamentally systemic. It's a collision between the slow, linear pace of human labor and the exponential financialized speed of assets. The game is mathematically rigged, and understanding that rigging is the first most critical step toward self-liberation and, frankly, mental peace.
You don't choose the era you're born into. You don't choose the economic structures that govern it, but you do choose how you stand within it. The true freedom that is available to you is that internal freedom, the ability to define your own worth, your own success, and your own stability. That's something that market forces and social expectations cannot take away from you. Don't let the inability to acquire an object under unjust terms define your entire existence or diminish the value of your effort.
So here is our final provocative thought for you to carry forward. Since prices are fundamentally driven by collective belief, by this illusion of consensus, what small individual action, what quiet choice could be the first step in eroding that powerful self-destructive social illusion? Perhaps it's choosing to rent without shame. Perhaps it's refusing to judge your peers by whether they own property. Or maybe it's simply refusing to prioritize land value over your own life quality. How does choosing your internal definition challenge the external standard that drives this entire crisis?